May 26, 1941. The North Atlantic. 8:55 p.m. The sky was a dark, bruising purple. A gale-force wind was whipping the tops off the waves, sending spray 50 feet into the air. On the deck of the German battleship Bismarck, the anti-aircraft gunners were tense. They were the best in the Kriegsmarine. Their ship was the most powerful warship ever built by a European nation. 50,000 tons of armor and guns. Just 2 days ago, they had blown the pride of the Royal Navy, the HMS Hood, out of the water in 6 minutes. They felt invincible. Then, the alarm bells rang. Aircraft approaching. Port bow. The gunners swung their 37mm and 20mm cannons. They expected to see modern bombers. Maybe twin-engine Bristol Beauforts. Instead, they saw something that looked like a joke. Emerging from the storm clouds were biplanes. They had 2 wings, stacked one on top of the other. They had fixed landing gear that dangled beneath them. They were covered in fabric that flapped in the wind. They looked like something from World War I. They looked like relics from a museum. The German fire control officers tried to lock on. Their sophisticated computers were designed to track modern aircraft flying at 200 or 300 miles per hour. But these planes were flying at 85 knots. They were flying so slow that the German computers couldn't calculate the lead. The guns were aiming too far ahead. The shells were exploding harmlessly in front of the attackers. The German gunners, frustrated, switched to manual control. They poured a wall of fire into the sky. The little biplanes didn't turn away. They bobbed and weaved in the wind, dropping lower and lower toward the white-capped waves. One biplane, piloted by Lieutenant John Moffett, flew straight at the Bismarck's massive armored belt. He was flying a plane made of Irish linen and spruce wood against a floating fortress of Krupp steel. He dropped his torpedo. The Germans watched the white wake streak toward their ship. They tried to turn. The explosion wasn't huge. It didn't sink the ship, but it hit the one place that mattered. The rudder. The Bismarck, the terror of the Atlantic, was jammed in a turn. It could only steam in a circle. The biplanes buzzed away into the clouds, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. The German crew stood on the deck, stunned. They had just been crippled by an aircraft that was obsolete before the war even started. They called them Stringbags. The British Admiralty wanted to scrap them. But on that stormy night in May, the Fairey Swordfish proved that technology isn't everything. Sometimes being slow, ugly, and obsolete is the only way to win. This is the story of the hunt for the Bismarck. It is the story of the David versus Goliath Battle of the Atlantic. It is the story of open cockpits in freezing storms. And it is the story of how a canvas biplane brought down the pride of the Third Reich. This is Forgotten Thunder. To understand the absurdity of this battle, you have to look at the machine. The Fairey Swordfish was designed in 1933. In aviation years, that is ancient. By 1941, the Spitfire was flying at 360 miles per hour. The German Bf 109 was flying at 350 miles per hour. The Swordfish had a top speed of 139 miles per hour. But if it was carrying a torpedo, that dropped to about 100 miles per hour. If there was a headwind, cars on the ground could drive faster than it. It was a biplane. Its fuselage was a metal frame covered in fabric, literally Irish linen, doped with lacquer to make it stiff. It had an open cockpit. The pilot, observer, and gunner sat exposed to the elements. In the North Atlantic, where temperatures dropped below freezing, this was torture. Crews wore heavy sheepskin flight suits, but they still got frostbite. The pilots nicknamed it the Stringbag. Because, like a housewife's string shopping bag, it could carry anything. Torpedoes, bombs, mines, flares, mail, pigeons. It was the workhorse of the Fleet Air Arm. In 1939, the Royal Navy wanted to replace it. They built the Fairey Albacore. They built the Barracuda. But the Swordfish refused to retire. It had one quality that the newer, faster planes lacked: handling. It was so stable that you could fly it hands-off. It could turn on a dime. And crucially, it could take off and land on an aircraft carrier in terrible weather. A modern monoplane needed speed to land, The Swordfish could float down onto a pitching deck at 60 knots. This quality would save the British Empire. Now, compare this to its enemy, the Bismarck. Launched in 1939, it was the pinnacle of German engineering. 823 feet long. 50,000 tons fully loaded. It had 8 15-inch guns that could fire a shell 24 miles. It had armor belts 12 inches thick made of Voton steel. It had a top speed of 30 knots, faster than most British battleships. It was designed to be unsinkable. It had sophisticated radar, optical rangefinders, and a crew of 2,000 elite sailors. When the Bismarck broke out into the Atlantic in May 1941, it was a crisis. Britain was surviving on convoys from America. If the Bismarck got loose in the Atlantic shipping lanes, it could sink a convoy a day. It could starve Britain into surrender in months. Winston Churchill issued a famous order: sink the Bismarck. The Royal Navy threw everything they had at it: battleships, battlecruisers, destroyers. On May 24, 1941, they found her. The pride of the Royal Navy, the massive battlecruiser HMS Hood, engaged the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait. It was a disaster. A shell from the Bismarck plunged through the Hood's thin deck armor and hit the magazine. The Hood exploded. It broke in half and sank in 3 minutes. Out of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. The British were in shock. Their greatest ship was gone. The Bismarck was loose. But the Bismarck was damaged. A shell from the HMS Prince of Wales had hit her fuel tank. She was leaking oil. Admiral Lütjens, the German commander, decided to run for safety. He set a course for the French port of Brest. There, he could repair the ship under the protection of the Luftwaffe. The British had to stop him before he reached the cover of German aircraft. But they had a problem. The Bismarck was faster than the British battleships chasing her. She was pulling away. The only thing fast enough to catch her was an airplane. The British aircraft carrier HMS Victorious was new. Her pilots were green. But she was the only carrier close enough. On the night of May 24th, she launched 9 Swordfish torpedo bombers. The weather was bad. Rain squalls. Low clouds. The Swordfish pilots, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, flew through the gloom. Their open cockpits were soaked. They found the Bismarck on radar. They attacked. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns opened up. It was a wall of tracers. The Swordfish dived through it. They dropped their torpedoes. One hit. It struck the Bismarck amidships, right on the main armor belt. The explosion killed 1 sailor and injured a few others, but the armor held. The damage was minimal. It was like throwing a pebble at a tank. The Swordfish returned to the Victorious, disappointed. They had hit the giant, but they hadn't stopped it. And now, things got worse. The Bismarck gave the British the slip. She made a sharp turn in the night and disappeared into the Atlantic vastness. For 31 hours, the British lost her. Panic set in at the Admiralty. If the Bismarck reached Brest, she would be safe. Then a stroke of luck. A Catalina flying boat spotted her oil slick. She was 700 miles from France. But the British battleships, King George V and Rodney, were too far behind. They couldn't catch her. There was only one hope left. Force H. Force H was sailing up from Gibraltar. It was led by the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. On board the Ark Royal were 2 squadrons of Swordfish, 810 and 818 squadrons. These were the veterans. The old hands. They knew their stringbags inside and out. But the weather was turning into a hurricane. May 26, 1941. The seas were rising to 40 feet. The flight deck of the Ark Royal was pitching up and down like a seesaw. Launching aircraft in these conditions was madness. The stern would rise 50 feet into the air and then crash down into the trough of a wave. But they had no choice. The Bismarck was getting closer to the German air cover. At 2:50 p.m., the Ark Royal turned into the wind. 15 Swordfish were ranged on the deck. The signal was given. The pilots gunned their Pegasus engines. The little biplanes struggled down the wet deck. As the bow dipped down, they fell off the end, vanishing from sight, only to claw their way back up into the sky inches above the waves. They flew into the cloud bank. Their radar picked up a ship. A massive ship. Target ahead. 14 swordfish dove through the clouds. They saw the gray hull. They dropped their torpedoes. But something was wrong. The ship wasn't firing back. The pilots realized their mistake too late. It wasn't the Bismarck. It was the HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been shadowing the Bismarck. They were attacking their own ship. It was a catastrophe. The torpedoes hit the water. The captain of the Sheffield, realizing what was happening, ordered hard a port. The cruiser turned violently. The torpedoes missed by yards. Some of the torpedoes had magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely when they hit the wake of the ship. The swordfish pilots, horrified, climbed back into the clouds. One pilot signaled to the Sheffield, "Sorry for the kippers." They returned to the Ark Royal in shame. They had wasted their strike. They had almost sunk their own cruiser. And they were running out of time. Sunset was approaching. Darkness would hide the Bismarck. By morning, she would be under the umbrella of the Luftwaffe. They had one chance left. One final strike. 8 p.m. May 26th. The storm was now a full gale. The wind was howling at 50 knots. On the Ark Royal, the ground crews were frantically rearming the swordfish. They switched the magnetic exploders, which had failed, for contact exploders. They set the depth to 22 feet. 15 swordfish engines coughed to life. Lieutenant Commander John "Jock" Moffett climbed into his cockpit. He looked at his observer, Dusty Miller. They gave each other a thumbs up. They launched into the twilight. The wind was so strong the planes were actually flying sideways, crab-walking through the air to maintain their course. They found the Sheffield again. The cruiser guided them to the target. "The enemy is 12 miles ahead," the Sheffield signaled. The swordfish climbed to 5,000 feet to get above the cloud layer. The cold was intense. Ice formed on the wings. Then the clouds broke. Below them, in the dark gray sea, was the Bismarck. It was firing every gun it had. The sky filled with black puffs of flak. The swordfish split up. They attacked from different angles to split the defensive fire. This is where the Stringbag's obsolescence became its greatest strength. The Bismarck's fire control computers were predicting the future position of the attacking aircraft. But they were programmed for modern speeds. They assumed a torpedo bomber would fly at 180 knots. The swordfish, flying into a 50-knot headwind, were barely moving at 85 knots ground speed. The German shells were exploding hundreds of yards in front of the planes. The Germans couldn't believe their eyes. It was like trying to shoot a butterfly with a rifle. The German gunners depressed their guns as low as they would go. They were firing into the water, trying to create splashes to knock the planes down. John Moffett saw his opening. He flew low, 50 feet off the water. He was looking at the port side of the ship. "I was flying straight into a furnace," he later said. "The tracers were coming at us like hosepipes." He had to get close. If he dropped too far away, the Bismarck would turn and comb the tracks. He waited. 1,000 yards. 800 yards. 600 yards. The massive silhouette of the battleship filled his vision. He could see the sailors running on the deck. "Let go," he shouted. The torpedo dropped. Moffett hauled the stick back. The swordfish groaned and banked away, its fabric wings vibrating. Moffett looked back. He saw the splash. He waited. It hit the stern. At first, it didn't seem like a fatal blow. The Bismarck didn't slow down. There was no massive fire. But deep inside the ship, catastrophe had struck. The torpedo had hit the steering gear compartment. The explosion had jammed the port rudder at a 12-degree angle. The Bismarck began to turn. The captain tried to countersteer with the engines. It didn't work. The ship turned into the wind. It turned toward the British fleet. The most powerful battleship in the world was stuck doing donuts in the Atlantic Ocean. It couldn't run away. It couldn't steer. It was a sitting duck. Admiral Lütjen sent a final message to Hitler: "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The mood on the Bismarck went from confidence to despair. They knew what was coming. The British battleships were closing in. The next morning, May 27th, the British battleships King George V and Rodney arrived. The Bismarck was moving slowly, erratically. The British opened fire at 8:47 a.m. The Bismarck fired back, but because she couldn't steer, her aim was thrown off. It was a brutal pounding. The British ships closed to point-blank range. They hammered the Bismarck into a burning wreck. The guns were silenced. The superstructure was flattened. But the Bismarck wouldn't sink. Her armor was too thick. Finally, the British cruiser Dorsetshire fired torpedoes into the burning hulk. At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck rolled over and capsized. Of the 2,200 men on board, only 114 survived. As the survivors were pulled from the oil-slicked water, many of them asked the British sailors the same question. What were those planes? They couldn't believe it. They had been defeated not by the mighty King George V, not by the heavy guns of the Rodney, but by a cloth-covered biplane that looked like a toy. The German propaganda machine tried to spin it. They claimed the Bismarck had been overwhelmed by hundreds of modern bombers. They couldn't admit the truth. It was too embarrassing. The Stringbag had done the impossible. The Fairey Swordfish continued to serve throughout the war. It outlived the planes that were supposed to replace it. It hunted U-boats with rockets. It landed on tiny escort carriers in the Arctic. It flew at night with radar. By 1945, it was more obsolete than ever, but it was still flying. John Moffat, the man who threw the torpedo that crippled the Bismarck, survived the war. He became a chicken farmer in Scotland. He kept a piece of the fabric from his swordfish as a souvenir. He always laughed when people asked him about the battle. They had the best technology in the world, he would say. But they forgot one thing. You can't calculate the lead on a plane that flies slower than the wind. The Bismarck was a symbol of Nazi power. It was steel, technology, and brute force. The Swordfish was a symbol of British tenacity. It was makeshift, slow, and stubborn. In the end, the biplane won. The German gunners laughed when they saw the Stringbags emerging from the clouds. They thought it was a joke. But one torpedo later, the joke was on them. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.